Well, good morning, everybody. We can give a clap. Welcome to everyone in the room and those of you joining us online. I'm so glad to see all of you. And if you're joining us for the very first time today or connecting in online, you are joining a conversation where we're talking about the future, things to come. Now, just that word, future, can evoke all kinds of emotions in us. Inspiration, optimism, hope, and enthusiasm of everything good that is going to come. Or it can make us feel a little stressed or overwhelmed, anxious, uncertain, in denial. Let's rather not talk about the future. Now, the thing is, I want you to know today, if you remember just one thing, it's the words of the American theologian Leonard Sweet. And he said that the future is not something that we enter into, but the future is something that we create. And you see, we've been taught that the future is out of our control. It's uncertain. It's unpredictable. It's left to chance. Or perhaps if you believe in God, the future is in God's hands. And while all of this is true, there's a subconscious, undeniable belief in every single one of you that the choices you make today somehow affect the tomorrow that you walk into. It affects your future. It's the reason why our parents have told us, do this and don't do that. Eat your veggies and lay off the sweets. Go here and not there. Make sure you do your homework. Be polite. It's the way that we parent like we do, those of us who have kids, because we believe at some level that the things that we choose today somehow affect the future that we have tomorrow. Now, in a room this size, there will be many of us who know people who've done different things when it comes to their future, made different choices. Some of you will know people who've made tragic and destructive choices that have somehow affected their future. Perhaps in a very extreme case, maybe even eliminated their future by the choices that they have made. Some of you will know people who've made courageous choices about their future, and they're inspiring. And you say to yourself, I wish I could be a little bit more like them, because the decisions that they have made have broken open a future that is simply incredible and is changing the world. I wish I had it in me to make some choices that could draw me into a future like that. Some of you in the room, your future has been impacted by the decisions of others, and really it had nothing to do with you. People in your world, or perhaps people you don't even know, have taken things into their own hands, made some decisions, perhaps contrary to the law, that have played out in your life and impacted you in a negative way. And you feel like you have no control over what's happened to you because someone else decided to do something and it's affected your future. Some of you in the room feel like you have a future that you don't deserve. Perhaps unexpected. Perhaps you dreamt or thought of a future that would be one way and something has happened. You got news from the doctor, a family member passed, something has happened, and the future that you once dreamt of, the future that you thought you deserved, is somehow, it's gone. You see, we live in this chaos of the choices that we make and the choices of others and how they play together and impact one another, how it plays out into our future. And somewhere God fits into this and is, if we believe, somehow guiding things and connecting the dots like we spoke about last week. And it's sort of moving forward. But in this place of overwhelm, in this place of choices, of uncertainty about the future, we can get a little bit overwhelmed and you can miss the potential that you have inside of you, because you feel confused about what's going on. You can begin to misunderstand what it means to be human. You can underestimate what God has put inside of you and the calling that He calls you to. But you are created to dream. You are created to imagine. You are created to be a person who has vision, made in the image of God, the creative force of the universe, and He calls you into a big future. Could you imagine what it would be like if you began to step into the full potential that God has put inside of you? You have been created with an invitation before you to watch God take the most destructive and hopeless of circumstances and create and bring about something beautiful. That is who you are. The future is not something that you enter into. The future, your future, is something that you create. You have the power to choose. Viktor Frankl, an Austrian psychiatrist, Jewish man, 9 months after he got married, was carried away with his whole family into the concentration camps of Nazi Germany. And in the concentration camps, he watched his father die of starvation. He watched his mother pass away. He watched his siblings pass, and eventually he lost his wife. And he was the only one of his family to survive through the concentration camps. And as a psychiatrist, he began to observe and become interested in what was it that set apart the people who made it through that devastating time. What was it about them that allowed some to persevere when others just gave up? And he collected all of his observations and he wrote many books, the most famous of which is called Man's Search for Meaning. Perhaps some of you have read it. And in there he says, there's one thing that cannot be taken from a man, the last of the freedoms, and that is the ability to choose your attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose your own way. You have the ability to choose your attitude no matter what the circumstances are in your life. You have the power to be able to make a choice that is going to impact your future, and that choice lies before you today. I want to spend the next few moments talking to you about the process to live with purpose. Is there a kind of step-by-step approach that you can take to be able to figure out how is it that you live a life of dreaming and envisioning and not just leaving it as a thought in the clouds, but actually walking that out and to say at the end of your time on this earth that I have lived my life, I've lived a life of purpose, I have done what I've been called to do, I have walked in the way in which I was created to walk. Is there a way that you can figure that out? And I want to speak to you today out of the book of Isaiah. And I'm excited to preach this passage because these verses have impacted and shaped my life. And up to now, I've never preached a message out of these verses. And I want to share 3 thoughts with you, 3 steps in the process to live with purpose. And I've come to realize that if we can follow these steps, if we can somehow grab a hold of them, if they can influence our minds and our decisions, and we can live into this, it will lead us to a place where we are ready to engage in a life of purpose, irrespective of the choices that others around us may make, but aligned with what God has called us to do. And I believe to do this, the first step is that we need to have a revelation of God's holiness. And then we need to have a recognition of our sinfulness. And then a reception of God's grace. And if we have a revelation of God's holiness, a recognition of our sinfulness, and a reception of God's grace, I believe that's what prepares us, prepares you to be able to live a life of purpose. And purpose is one of the things we often talk about. And it's somehow ethereal, it's out there, it's intangible for many of us. But what if it was a little less complicated? And it was more about the posture of our hearts and the attitude of our spirit that led us into purpose, rather than what job you have or where you live. What if purpose was a little different to what you think it is? So we're going to go to Isaiah chapter 6. And as we go here, I want you to imagine with me for a moment. Even if you want to close your eyes when I read it just now, imagine you are there in this story. Isaiah was a prophet who lived 800 years before Jesus was born. He lived at a time when the Assyrian Empire was becoming the superpower of the world, and they were conquering nations all around them as they expanded. And Israel was in the fallout. Israel had its own issues. They'd already split into a southern kingdom, Judah, and a northern kingdom, the 10 other tribes. And there was a lot of angst between the people of Israel. And to make it worse, they turned their back on God and they'd started to worship the gods of the land, the false gods. And there were a lot of things going wrong in the nation of Israel at the time when Isaiah lived. And as the Assyrian Empire began to expand, eventually what would happen is they would come and they would raid and capture the whole of the northern kingdom of Israel and take them into exile. And then the Babylonian Empire would rise up, crush the Assyrians, and come and take away the southern kingdom of Israel and take them into exile. Things were not going good for Israel. And it's into this context that we read the words of the prophet Isaiah. He's already spent 5 chapters kind of unpacking a little bit of the story, but at the beginning of chapter 6, something happens. There's a shift that happens, and he has this incredible vision that God gives him. And this is the part where I want you to imagine that you are there as I read these words. You put yourself into the story and let them come alive to you. So we'll go to Isaiah chapter 6. I'll read from verse 1. In the year that King Uzziah died, and this is how we know because he's a historical figure, that when it was that Isaiah lived, I saw the Lord sitting upon a throne. This has got to give you a little bit of a hint that this is dangerous territory, because at this time it was believed that if you saw God, you would die. The very first line of Isaiah's vision, I saw the Lord sitting on a throne high and lifted up. The train of his robe filled the temple. Above him stood the seraphim. Each had 6 wings. With 2 he covered his face, with 2 he covered his feet, and with 2 he flew. And one called to another and said, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is filled with his glory. And the foundations of the thresholds shook at the voice of him who called, and the house was filled with smoke. And I said, Woe is me, for I am lost. I'm a man of unclean lips, and I dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips, for my eyes have seen the Lord of hosts. You get the feel that Isaiah is terrified. He's shaking in his boots. The building is shaking. There's smoke. There's an earthquake. There's this glory of God which he sees, and he's fearing for his life. And he didn't get to choose that he would step into this vision. I don't know what was happening. He was kind of walking along one day, and suddenly he sees this picture of the Lord on his throne. And then one of the seraphim, one of these crazy creatures with 6 wings, flew to me, having in his hand a burning coal that he'd taken with him with tongs from the altar. I like the way that the seraphim uses a pair of bright tongs to get the coal and comes to Isaiah with the coal. Can you imagine being Isaiah? Just think about that for a moment. Here you are in a place where what you're seeing is supposed to kill you. There's these crazy 6-winged creatures flying around. One of them goes to the fire, gets a coal, and brings it towards you. What would you do? Come on, be honest. What would you do? Here we go. If someone takes a tongue from a fire at the Bride this weekend and goes after you, what are you going to do? You're going to run. Isaiah's got nowhere to go. He's stuck in a vision. It's in his mind. One of the seraphim flew to me, having in his hand a burning coal. He'd taken the tongs from the altar, and he touched my mouth. Ouch. And he said, Behold, this has touched your lips. Your guilt is taken away, and your sin atoned for. And I heard the voice of the Lord saying, Whom shall I send? And who will I go for us? And then Isaiah said, Here I am. Send me. And what happens next is God calls him into a life of purpose. And his mission is to go and to preach to the southern kingdom of Israel. And God gives him a little heads up. He gives him a tip. He says, Isaiah, when you go and share this message, when you go and do what I've called you to do, they're not going to listen, but go anyway. And as Isaiah's life unfolds, he gets to write chapters towards the end of his prophecies that speak about Jesus, the one who is to come. And it's in these few verses, in this incredible, crazy, weird vision, that these keys come, these steps for us, these steps for you to be able to live a life of purpose. Because before the story, Isaiah was writing about everything that was going on, and suddenly something shifts, something changes, and he gets to the point where he goes from woe is me to here I am. What is it that happened? What changed? What shifted? Well, the very first thing that happened is Isaiah had a revelation of God's holiness. He had this picture, this vision, this incredible encounter, which somehow changed his view of who God was. I think he had an idea about God. He knew that if I see God, I'm probably going to die. But suddenly he's able to articulate in detail what he's seeing. He's seeing this Lord who's thrown or on a throne, and his robe fills the whole room, and there's glory. So my question to you, what is it when you hear the word holy? What's the word picture that comes into your mind? Let's hear some answers. I want to make sure you guys are tracking, keeping up. Holy means? Say louder, louder. Pure, clean, set apart, strong, blameless. What about holy? No one think that? Come on, most of you thought that, right? Holy, you're like, oh, the self-righteous people, the morally good. I'm too holy. Come on. Anyone? Was it just me? There's a few of you. If I hear the word holy, that's often where my mind goes. Is I think of people who are like, oh, they're just so holy. They're just so holy. Those of you who shouted out answers, you're giving the right answers, not what you're actually thinking. Because you're like me. I hear the word holy and I think of moral goodness. And there is a sense of moral goodness when it comes to holy. But the picture more, it's more. Have you been outside, not in our city, but last time you went to the Kruger Park or somewhere and you looked up at the night sky and you saw the Milky Way and you saw the stars in the heavens. And you had this feeling as you looked into space and you watched all those little twinkling stars out there, and you began to imagine how far away they are and how many of them there are. And suddenly you got this feeling inside of you that something goes like something like this, like, wow, I feel pretty insignificant right now. This is what holiness means. Holiness means there's nothing else like it. It's that feeling. When you see something holy, it's that your response is inside of you. You just go like, I'm totally insignificant. I am small. Or when you look out over the ocean and you see the waves and you watch the wind and you see the storms and you just feel insignificant because something is so holy. Holy really means unique. It does mean moral good, yes, but more so it means there's nothing like this. It means to be set apart, unique. Isaiah's vision, there's a blazing glory in the room. It's a bright light. Really, the essence is this is the creative force of the universe behind everything that exists. This is holy. Holiness is the desire within God to make everything good and right and pure. Everything about God is holy. It's his character, it's his nature, there's nothing else like himness, his uniqueness. This is what holy means. And then there's these seraphim flying around. Like, what are those things? 6 wings, 2 covering their faces because they can't look at God, 2 flying, 2 covering their feet. Could it speak of being ready to go at God's command? It's the only place in the Bible this word is used, seraphim, but there's some other clues that we have. In Genesis chapter 3, there's something called a cherubim, which is set to guard Eden, where Adam and Eve were, and they were removed from, and God puts a cherubim with a flaming sword to guard this place, this plan, this intention that God has created from sinful man. Then in Ezekiel, again, he speaks about a cherubim, but these cherubim have 4 wings and not 6 wings, but they're also flying around and speaking about God's holiness. And then we get to Revelation, and there's cherubim again, and they have 6 wings and eyes all over them. You kind of go like, what's up with these things? Especially when you understand that the word seraphim, it really means a burning snake. And it's got wings, so it's flying. So here we have a burning snake with 6 wings that are flying around God. What is going on? A side note, what these are not is a cherub. Because do you know the word cherub that we use? We have this idea that it's a chubby baby flying around, like playing harps, like a Cupid thing. This is not seraphim. This is not cherubim. What happened here is this word cherubim got taken through the Renaissance, and in the end we had a chubby baby that flies around. And somehow it affects our picture of what angels is, and it's not that. Think burning snake flying with 6 wings. But it's less of an anatomy lesson to going how many wings, how many eyes. Really, when we read literature like this in the scriptures, we've got to ask, what's the point of it? And there's 2 points here. The point of the seraphim is to guard the presence of God. Because the presence of God is so holy, there's a guardian that stops others from entering in the presence of God for their own protection. It's the same as Genesis 3, the cherubim that was placed outside the garden. It stops people from returning. So it's a spiritual being, a spiritual creature, by the way, which inspired quite a bit of Tolkien's work. Lord of the Rings fans in the house? And the other idea behind it is that every spiritual being has to answer to God. The most fearsome of creatures has to answer to God because He's holy. He's holy. It's kind of like the sun. The sun, however million miles away it is, the closest we can get to it, NASA says, if you're in a space shuttle, is 1.3 million miles. And if you get any closer, you'll just spontaneously combust in your space shuttle. In 1 second, the sun produces the same amount of energy that us humans will consume in 15 million years. Take that, ESCOM. 1 second. Surface temperature of the sun, 5,500 degrees Celsius. You can't get close to the sun because it's holy. It's not that the sun is bad. It's just that it's holy. This is what God is like. He's holy. So what is the picture of God for you? What is your picture of God? It's a grumpy-ish man on a throne somewhere up there in heaven with a long beard, more like Father Christmas than the sun. Maybe he's angry, maybe he's smiling a little bit, maybe he's disinterested in you. I got to be honest, in the beginning of my faith journey, I thought God was like a grandpa, Where do we get these images from? They impact our view of who God is. But without an understanding of who God is and His holiness, we will never get to live a life with purpose. The first step in being able to live a life of purpose is to have a revelation of God's holiness. And if there's one thing that you shifts in your minds today, is to take out whatever picture of who God is for you and replace it with something that makes you shake in your boots when you think about who God is and how powerful He is. I think many of us, and I include myself in this, have a casual view of who God is. Yeah, He's just a nice guy. And He's around somewhere. But no, He's holy. He's holy. Holy, unique. And the thing is, what happens is when you have a revelation of who God is and His holiness, what it does is it gives you a recognition of your sinfulness. And if you want to know if you've had a revelation of who God is and His holiness, your response is telling. If it doesn't move you to a place where you recognize your sinfulness and your shortfalls and your weaknesses and your brokenness, then I'm not sure if you've had a revelation of who God is. Because this is Isaiah's response. He sees the holiness of God, and his immediate response is, "Woe is me, I'm a man of unclean lips, and I come from a people of unclean lips." And he's expecting, because he's come close to holiness, he expects, I'm finished, I'm going to die. It's kind of like a bright spotlight being shone onto your life. And there's a whole bunch of things in there that you don't want other people to see. And when you come into the presence of God, what happens is you suddenly want to do what Adam and Eve did and cover up and hide. In the town where I went to high school, one of the boys' schools, high schools, had this tradition. Not the school that I went to, but another one. And what would happen when you got to matric, the guys would, in the middle of the night, bunk out of the boarding establishment, take all their clothes off, run down the road 2 kilometers to the girls' school, get outside the girls' hostel, do a war cry, dive into the pool, swim a length of backstroke, and run back to the boarding house before the cops came. Now, what would happen is everyone was very brave when everything was in the dark. But as soon as the war cry began, all the floodlights came on around the pool. And all of a sudden, what was everyone doing? Covering up what they didn't want anyone to see. It's the same thing that happens when we enter into the presence of God. Is there's a whole lot of stuff in our life that we go, I don't want anyone to see this. But this is the process. This is part of the process of living a life with purpose. Is one, to have a revelation of who God is. And what that does, it takes you to a place where you go, Oh my goodness. There's a lot of stuff in my life that I don't want the holiness of God to touch, that I don't want the eyes of God to see. Let me let you in a little secret. He knows everything already. It's more yourself you've got to get over, like, oh my goodness, okay, now I'm starting to believe that God actually knows about these things in my life. So what is your response when you begin to understand the holiness of God? What goes on inside of you? What are the feelings that happen? Do you go like, oh, I've got to hide that. God, don't look here. Don't look too closely. Don't inspect these things. Or do you go, woe is me? What is your response? Actually, I don't have to ask you because you do what I do. I do this. Well, at least I'm not as bad as them. Yeah, I know I've got some stuff, but at least I'm not as bad as that person. I mean, that family is really dysfunctional. Like, my family's got some issues, but them. So God, you know, like, I'm not that bad. Would you listen to yourself? Before holiness itself, what are you're justifying yourself based on your behavior. And suddenly we fall into this trap of self-righteousness. And I do this, and you do this, and you tell yourself, oh, I'm not that bad. I'm not that bad. I'm not that bad. And what you're doing is you're beginning to fall into a works-based religion where your salvation is based on how not bad you are. Am I speaking to somebody in the room today? Or is it for the person next to you? A revelation of God's holiness takes you to a place where you begin to realize your sinfulness, and the appropriate response is to fall down on your knees and go, woe is me. My self-righteousness is never going to be good enough to be anything like that holiness. On my own strength, my own merit, my own I'm not so bad as them, my own covering up, my own trying to pretend like everything is fine is never going to be enough for me to come close to holiness, because if I do in that state, that holiness is simply going to consume me. Not because the holiness is bad, but because it's so good. So woe is us. Where to from here? Doesn't sound like a good situation. But you see what happens in the process to live with purpose is when you have a revelation of the holiness of God, and it takes you to a point when you begin to admit and acknowledge your own brokenness. And it's so interesting to me that Isaiah says, I'm a man of unclean lips, because he hears the seraphim speaking, holy, holy, holy. I wonder if he's going, I can't say holy, holy, holy with conviction in my heart because I'm broken. My lips are unclean. I shouldn't even be here. God, you shouldn't even, like, what are you even doing? I can't even get close to you. But then something shifts. Is God himself initiates a rescue mission for Isaiah, and he does the same for you. And God sends the seraphim, that burning, fiery serpent, to go to the altar, and what happens at an altar is a sacrifice is made. And you see, this is how it works, is when you have a revelation of God's holiness, it leads you to a place of a recognition of your sinfulness. When you put those two things together, it prepares you for a reception of God's grace. And without a revelation of God's holiness, without a recognition of your brokenness and your sinfulness, without that, you will not have a preparation to receive the grace of God. And this is the third step in the process, is a revelation of holiness that leads me to a recognition of my sinfulness. And when I've got those two things, it opens the way, it prepares the way for me to be ready to receive the grace of God. And this is how it works, is the seraphim goes to the altar, which is the place of sacrifice, of substitution. It takes a coal and goes to Isaiah and touches the lips of Isaiah. And if I was Isaiah in that moment, I would think I'm about to be destroyed. Like, this is the end for me. But the holiness of God, it doesn't terminate him. It transforms him. It shifts him. It changes him. And the holiness, which should have destroyed him, redefines him. And the seraphim says, Your lips, those unclean lips you were worried about, they are now clean. And your sin has been taken away and your guilt has been atoned for. You see, friends, you are not saved because of your good works. You are saved because the sacrifice was made. You were saved because someone went to the altar in your place. And you see the picture of what's happening is the one, the guardian of the presence of God, the holiness of God from the brokenness of man, is the one who initiates the response. And the holiness of God is transferred to the unclean person. And I was thinking about that, is how Isaiah complained about having unclean lips, and the seraphim goes directly, not to his toe, not to his knee, not to his elbow, not to his forehead, but directly to the source of Isaiah's uncleanness and says, you are holy. And some of you are sitting in the room and there's something in your life which you feel like disqualifies you from the purpose that God calls you to. And this is what God does, is He takes His grace and He takes it to that thing, whichever it is, whatever it is for you, that thing that's holding you back, the thing that you disqualify yourself by, that thing in your past, that mistake, that failure, and His grace comes to that thing like a laser beam and says, your sin is taken away and your guilt is atoned for. And the holiness of God, it doesn't destroy you like it should. It doesn't terminate you, but it actually transforms you. And this is an incredible concept of a transfer of holiness, but you can only be ready to receive the grace of God when you first understand who God is and how holy He is, and that makes you in awe, like those moments when you look up at the stars and you feel inferior and insignificant, and that leads you to introspect and go, oh, woe is me. I cannot stand on my own self-righteousness. I cannot compare myself and say I'm better to them. I'm just going like, oh my goodness, God, you are so holy and I am so not. And it's in that moment of reception or preparation of your heart to that God says, now you're ready for my grace. And sometimes we want to take the grace of God without acknowledging our brokenness or without having an understanding of who God is. And then we wonder, why are we stuck? Why are we struggling? Why are we not transformed? Because we haven't had the revelation of His holiness. We haven't recognized our sin, so we're not ready to receive His grace. But when those things line up, then you are ready. You are ready in a place to receive His grace. And the transformation that happens in Isaiah is he goes from a place of going, woe is me, to here I am, send me. Do you want to live a life of purpose? This is what you need, is to understand who God is and His holiness and have a revelation of that it begins to overwhelm you, and then to have a recognition of your sinfulness and let that begin to overwhelm you. And when you are in that place, you receive God's grace, and when you receive God's grace, what does it do? It transforms you. And it takes you to a place of going, woe is me, to when God asks, who can we send? And you say, here I am, God, send me. What happened in Isaiah? He didn't go on a public speaking course. He didn't go study theology. He didn't take years to get ready. What happened is he received the grace of God into his life that took away his sin, took away his guilt, and suddenly he was ready for purpose. And he said, here I am, send me. And far too often we're waiting until then, until I've done that, until I've studied this, until I've been there. I'm not ready. No, do you know who God is? Do you know He's holy? Do you know your sinfulness? Have you received His grace? Then He's calling you. It's time to put your hand up and say, here I am, God, send me, because you've done everything to make me holy. Here I am. Send me. Send me. You see, purpose is less about where you work and what you do and what your job title is. Purpose is more about understanding the holiness of God, recognizing that you are broken and sinful, but that God is so good that He fixes it by taking a coal from the altar, from the sacrifice, and putting it upon your life in that area, taking away the sin, taking away the guilt, and saying, now you're ready. I mean, it's a crazy question, right? Isaiah is there in his vision, the seraphim are flying around, God's in the room. And God's like, who should we send? Isaiah in the corner. Well, I guess it's me. I've got to believe, I've got to trust God that you've prepared me to be ready to live the life of purpose that you've called me to. 800 years after Isaiah, there was another man. Jesus. Matthew chapter 8, Jesus is walking down a mountainside. He's being followed by large crowds. And he's teaching, and people are starting to go, there's something holy about this guy. Not morally good, he was that, but there's something unique about this guy. And they're following, and they're going after him. And as he's walking down the hill, he comes upon a man with leprosy. Leprosy at that time was incurable, and the lepers themselves would have to announce their presence to the rest of their community by going, unclean, unclean, unclean. And as the lepers would walk, the crowds would split because no one else wanted to catch that because he would be excommunicated outside of the city. So they had to shout, declare their uncleanness. Unclean. If you got near them, you might catch leprosy. So everyone avoided them literally like the plague. And Jesus walks to this guy. And Matthew 8 verse 2 says, and he began to worship him. What is worship? Worship is a revelation of holiness. A revelation, recognition of your own insignificance, and a response that declares the holiness. So here's a leper declaring the holiness of Jesus. He's worshiping him. And they have this conversation. Jesus talks to this man who's been unclean, excommunicated, the social outcast that no one wants to look at. The leper's worshiping, and Jesus says to him, what do you want me to do for you? And the leper says, well, if you're willing, would you heal me? And Jesus says, hi, I'm willing. And he touches him. And everyone watching goes, Jesus, don't touch it, you're going to get leprosy. And they watch, and suddenly something happens before their eyes. The leper is transformed. And his body is healed. And the sore is closed. And they see what's happened is the holiness of Jesus has not terminated the leper. Jesus hasn't caught leprosy, but the holiness of Jesus has been transferred into the leprous person, the unclean one. And Jesus tells him to stand up. He says, don't go tell anyone about this. Like, yeah, right, Jesus. Sure, I'm going to be able to do that. But go to the temple and make the sacrifice in accordance with the law of Moses as a testimony towards them. What did Jesus do? He sent him on a life of purpose. What had happened, what shifted is an encounter with the grace of God, the holiness of God. In a moment, things shift. Some of you in the room today, you've walked in with something in your life, and I feel like the seraphim, that fiery serpent, the guardian of the presence of God, the Holy Spirit, if you will, wants to bring a coal and just apply it to that area. And that you hear the words of God declare, your sin is taken away and your guilt is atoned for. And now it's time, beloved child, to stand on your feet and respond to the call of God when he says, who shall we send? Who shall we send? And the people of Free Church go, here we are, God, send us. Not because we're good, not because we think we're better than them, but because we know how holy God is and we know how broken we are, but also because that's prepared us to have a revelation of his grace. And when we take that upon our lives and we're receptive to the grace of God, it doesn't kill us, it doesn't destroy us, but it transforms us. And if you want to know if you've had an experience of the grace of God, your life will be transformed. You will walk in here one way and you will walk out a different way. Transformation happens in a moment in the presence of God. I'd love to pray for you. I feel like all of us have something, a mind shift to change, a decision to make something, an application, reception of the grace of God in an area of your life, maybe just a revelation of the holiness of God where you realize, God, I've been treating you just like way too casual for the last however many years, but this is a moment where I want to be awed by your holiness, where I want to fall down on my knees and worship you, where I'm at a place where I realize the extent of my self-righteousness and my justifying myself and saying I'm better than this person, and actually just acknowledging, go, no, I'm broken and I need grace, and then receiving that grace. So what? Why don't you stand? Why don't you stand? Close your eyes. Just open your hands, if you will, just as a sign of it. Like Amy said earlier, open heart towards God. Just a posture of humility. God, the most important thing in this room is that your words to your people take root in hearts today. And Lord, I don't know what it is. I don't know everyone's stories and the details of your stories, but God, I know my story. And I know how this story of Isaiah 6 has changed my life. And there's been moments of transformation where, just like that seraphim has come and the coal from the altar has come and changed, brought freedom, brought transformation. I pray for those in the room and those online, God, who are in need of a revelation of your holiness and of your power, that as we respond in worship in just a moment and declare the name of Jesus, Holy Spirit, I pray you fall in